Look around you, right now, in this very moment. Become consciously aware of the space you currently occupy. Feel the gentle, unwavering, almost magical comfort of the room you're in. Notice the steady, invisible, and utterly reliable temperature, a personal climate that you command with a simple, thoughtless touch of a dial. Listen. Listen to the silent, omnipresent hum of the electrical grid, that quiet, unspoken promise that light, information, entertainment, and connection are all yours to summon with the mere flick of a switch. We navigate our modern lives wrapped in a thick, warm, and comforting blanket of certainty, a technological cocoon meticulously woven from centuries of human innovation, a fortress of comfort designed with the sole purpose of separating us from a world that is, at its most fundamental and honest core, ruthlessly, beautifully, and completely indifferent to our individual survival. But what if that cocoon, that blanket of certainty, was violently and irrevocably stripped away? What if your continued existence, your very next breath, depended not on the accumulated power of our collective technology, but on the accumulated, hard-won weight of your own personal knowledge? What if your comfort was measured not by a thermostat, but by your intimate, cellular, and deeply intuitive understanding of fire, stone, air, wood, and snow? What if your shelter was not a static, passive, inanimate box, but a living, breathing, organic machine, a dynamic, self-regulating life support system built from nothing more than mud, timber, animal hides, and the forgotten, whispering ghosts of ancient, essential wisdom? Between the pivotal years of 1820 and 1880, a few thousand men, a number smaller than the population of a single modern city block, voluntarily ventured into the brutal, untamed, and unforgiving heart of the North American Rocky Mountains. They faced winters of such unimaginable and relentless savagery that they could extinguish the life of an unprepared person in less time than it takes to watch a television show. Yet some of them didn't just survive for a single, harrowing season. They endured for decades, becoming as much a permanent feature of the landscape as the granite peaks, the ancient pines, and the creatures they hunted. They possessed no Gore-Tex, no GPS, no downfilled parkas, no emergency beacons, no rescue helicopters. They had something far more powerful, far more elemental, a hidden, hard-won, and often fatal to acquire genius for creating sustainable pockets of life in the very face of certain, overwhelming death. Tonight, we are not just going to glance at their quaint historical log cabins. We are going to perform a deep, forensic autopsy on their survival systems. We will deconstruct them piece by piece, layer by intricate layer. We will unearth the lost science and the forgotten art behind their life-saving structures, from the arcane, almost mystical skill of reading the land's hidden language, to the sophisticated, intuitive thermal engineering that allowed them to conjure vibrant oases of life-sustaining warmth in a universe of crushing, absolute, and soul-destroying cold. This is the story of how to build a shelter that breathes, that thinks, that flexes with the seasons, and that actively fights back against the deadliest winters on planet Earth. So settle in, get truly comfortable. Trust me on this one. You are about to discover in exhaustive detail why your warm, smart, modern house might be profoundly and fundamentally dumber than a meticulously crafted pile of mud and logs from 200 years ago. Your eyes snap open, not to light, not to sound, but to a profound and absolute darkness. It's a primordial black, an ink blot nothingness that exists only in the deepest wilderness, far from the faintest, most distant memory of artificial light. But it wasn't the darkness that woke you, it was the cold. It hits your face, the only part of your body exposed to the shelter's air, like a physical slap from an invisible hand. It's a dry, biting, invasive cold. A cold that feels less like a passive temperature and more like an active, intelligent predator, relentlessly searching for a way in. You are Nathaniel, a name that feels like it belongs to another man from another lifetime. This is your third winter in the high Rockies, and the mountains are only just beginning to decide if they will suffer you to live. You are lying on a raised wooden platform, a crude but brilliantly effective bed, buried beneath the immense, reassuring weight of three thick, winter prime buffalo robes. The fur, worn smooth and supple over decades of use by men before you, isn't soft like the feather beds and wool blankets you dimly remember from a life back in civilized Pennsylvania. But it is a universe of comfort away from the frozen, unforgiving ground just a few feet below, a ground that is as hard and cold as iron. The air inside the small log shelter is currently hovering around freezing, a temperature that would send a modern person fumbling for a thermostat and an extra blanket. But in your world, this is a colossal, hard-won victory, because just beyond these four walls, a full-blown, multi-day blizzard is attempting to tear the mountains apart, dragging the ambient temperature down to a soul-crushing negative 30 degrees Fahrenheit, a number that ceases to be an abstract measurement and becomes a lethal force. The sound that finally registered in your sleeping brain, the sound that woke you, is the blizzard's voice, a special kind of deep, resonant howl that seems to vibrate in your bones and teeth. It is the sound of imminent, violent death, a shrieking, demonic promise that any living creature caught unprotected in its embrace would become a frozen, brittle statue in well under an hour. Unlike the cozy, predictable bedroom in a temperature-controlled house you abandoned years ago, your continued survival here in this moment is tethered to a single, flickering source of life, the massive stone fireplace that dominates the far wall of the small room. And its fire, the roaring, cheerful blaze you so carefully built before succumbing to exhaustion, has burned dangerously low. The vibrant, crackling roar of the evening has decayed into a faint, pathetic, pulsing red glow of embers, a dying heartbeat. If that heartbeat stops, if the fire goes out completely, the fragile, miraculous bubble of survivable air inside this shelter will rapidly collapse. The predatory, intelligent cold outside will seep through every microscopic crack, every porous fiber of wood, and you might simply grow too cold to dream and never wake up. The first, last, and most sacred rule of mountain living echoes in your mind, not in your own voice, but in the gravelly, raspy cadence that has become the unwavering narrator of your own survival. It's the voice of your mentor, the man who took you in as a greenhorn, the veteran trapper Samuel Mackenzie. His words are as solid and real as the stones in the hearth. Fire dies, you die. You kneel at the hearth and carefully, with the reverence of a priest at an altar, add a single small log from the precisely stacked wood pile beside it. The pile is arranged by size and wood type, a testament to the forethought survival demands. You select a piece of dry pine not too big, or it will smother the precious, faintly breathing coals. Not too small, or it will burn out in a useless, wasteful flash. This is a science, a delicate life or death ritual, and getting it wrong means everything. But let's back up even further. How did you, Nathaniel, how did any of these men end up in this frozen, God-forsaken hellscape? Between 1820 and 1840, a veritable tide of roughly 3,000 men, mostly young and desperate, washed into the vast, uncharted territory of the Rocky Mountains. They were chasing a single seductive prize, the pelt of the North American beaver. Back then, beaver fur was the crude oil of its day, the essential raw material for the fashionable, high-status felt hats worn in the grand cities of London, Paris, and the eastern United States. A good trapper, a man who was not only skilled and tireless, but also inhumanly lucky, could make more money in a single trapping season than a factory worker back in Boston or Philadelphia could hope to make in 5 grueling years of labor. The financial incentive was a siren's call, promising unimaginable fortune and a life of absolute untethered freedom. But freedom in the high mountains came with a staggering, non-negotiable price, a price paid in constant hardship, meticulous preparation, and, all too often, blood. You know what truly separates the dead trappers from the living ones, boy? Old Sam's phantom voice is in your head again, as clear and sharp as if he were standing right beside you, his shadow dancing on the wall, poking at the fire with a gnarled stick. It ain't luck. It ain't how good you are with that fancy rifle of yours. It ain't even how tough you think you are. It's knowing where to build. It's all in the choosing. He was absolutely right. And this is the part of the story that defies all the romantic, heroic notions of the tough, grizzled, solitary frontiersman. The entire foundation of winter survival, the very bedrock upon which all other skills were built, wasn't about physical toughness or marksmanship. It was about real estate. Location, location, location. The fateful decision between a long life and a quick frozen death was made months before the first snowflake ever fell, with the single most critical, irreversible choice a mountain man would ever make: choosing the right spot to build his winter shelter. One single catastrophic error in judgment, picking a spot prone to hidden avalanches, building in a natural wind tunnel, choosing a place too far from a reliable water source, or too exposed to the prevailing storms, and you'd be a frozen, forgotten footnote in the history of the West before the first big blizzard even had a name. Site selection was not just a task, it was a sacred art, a form of prophecy. These men were not just looking for pretty views or convenient locations. They were reading the landscape like a living, breathing survival manual, a text written in a complex language of contours, tree lines, shadows, and the subtle scars of past winters. First and most importantly was the relentless pursuit of natural wind protection. The prevailing winter winds in the Rocky Mountains are merciless, constant, and predominantly from the northwest. They are the true, undisputed killers, far more efficient and cruel than the passive cold itself. Wind chill is a force of physics that can strip the heat from a human body with terrifying, almost supernatural speed. Sam's words on the subject were, as always, blunt and unforgettable. Cold takes hours to kill you, boy. It's a slow dance. Wind takes minutes. It's a mugging in a dark alley. Therefore, the ideal, the only acceptable spot would be on the leeward side of a significant terrain feature, preferably a southeast-facing slope, which would be shielded from that prevailing, life-stealing onslaught. Mountain men would spend days, even weeks, meticulously scouting for locations tucked securely behind large, ancient rock formations, nestled deep within dense groves of aspen or pine, or situated in natural depressions and hollows that could deflect, break, and tame the fury of the wind. This obsessive focus wasn't about mere comfort. It was about obeying a non-negotiable law of thermodynamics. A well-protected shelter could reduce its heating requirements, the amount of firewood needed to stay alive, by as much as a staggering 60%. That percentage is the difference between having enough firewood to last through a month-long, cabin fever-inducing blizzard and freezing to death in the silent, suffocating dark in the middle of January when your precious, hard-won supplies inevitably run out. But for many, including yourself, Nathaniel, it wasn't just about the money. The money was the excuse, the rationalization. The true pull was something deeper, more primal. It was the promise of absolute, untethered freedom. Back east, society was becoming more crowded, more structured, more constrained. Land was becoming more expensive. Opportunities were calcifying. The West, in the collective imagination, was a blank slate, a vast empty canvas upon which a man could paint a new life, a life lived on his own terms, governed by no law but the law of nature and his own strength and wits. It was a powerful, intoxicating myth, a myth that conveniently ignored the fact that this empty land was already home to numerous and powerful Native American tribes, and that the freedom it offered was the freedom to starve, to freeze, or to die a violent death, alone and 1,000 miles from home. You remember the suffocating feeling of your life back in Pennsylvania? The endless, muddy fields of the family farm, the rigid social expectations, the predetermined path that stretched out before you like a long, dull, and dusty road. The stories filtering back from the West, tales of men like Jedediah Smith and Jim Bridger, were like a potent drug. They spoke of a world of unimaginable scale, of mountains that touched the sky, of rivers teeming with life, of a personal sovereignty that was impossible to even conceive of back in the settled lands. And so, like so many others, you made the bargain. You traded safety for possibility. You traded comfort for freedom. And now, as you kneel before a dying fire in the heart of a frozen, indifferent wilderness, the terms of that bargain are being tested in the most brutal way imaginable. You deliberately, carefully push aside the immense weight of the buffalo robes. The movement is slow, a conscious conservation of energy. It sends a thick cloud of your own frozen breath billowing into the frigid air, a ghostly testament to the life still within you. You swing your legs over the edge of the sleeping platform, your bare feet instinctively searching for the rough, brain-tanned leather moccasins you left perfectly positioned for this exact moment. Even the few seconds your feet might spend on the cold, packed dirt floor would be a jolt of raw, debilitating agony, stealing precious warmth that would take hours to regenerate. The pervasive cold makes your left shoulder ache with a deep, throbbing, familiar pain. It's a memento from your first year, a poorly healed wound from a Blackfoot arrow that serves as your personal, internal barometer. When it throbs with this grinding intensity, it means the storm isn't just a passing squall, it's a major weather system, settling in for a long, ugly, multi-day stay. As you pad silently across the floor to the fireplace, every creak of the floorboards under your weight is a reminder of the intricate, life-sustaining structure around you. Most people back in the East, their heads filled with romantic novels and fanciful paintings, imagine a mountain man's home as a rustic, picturesque cabin. They picture a charming little cottage with a cute fieldstone chimney puffing out gentle, welcoming smoke, perhaps with a hand-carved rocking chair on a quaint front porch. The reality is infinitely more sophisticated, brutally less comfortable, and designed with the single-minded purpose of a weapon. This shelter isn't a home in the conventional sense. It's a wilderness life support machine, a bespoke fortress meticulously engineered from logs, stones, mud, grass, and the hides of slain animals. You might call it crude, looking at the rough, axe-hewn log walls and the simple dirt floor. But that's where you would be fatally, tragically wrong. These shelters were marvels of applied physics, intuitive geology, and organic engineering, built with an astonishingly simple toolkit: axes, knives, maybe an auger, and a vast unwritten library of knowledge that had been paid for in the currency of blood and bone. And Sam would know. By 1837, the year you, a naive and utterly unprepared boy of 19, first stumbled into his winter camp, he had already survived 17 of these Rocky Mountain winters. He was a living legend, a relic from the first wave of trappers, a man who had outlasted hundreds, perhaps thousands, of other men. Men who were braver, stronger, younger, better armed, all of whom had made just one critical, unforgivable mistake. That is the brutal, simple truth about life in these mountains during the Great Beaver Fur Rush. There were no second chances. There were no rescue teams, no emergency services, no park rangers to call for help. There was only you, the library of knowledge you carried in your head, and whatever you could build, hunt, or fight for with your own two freezing hands. So congratulations, Nathaniel. You are a mountain man in the dead of winter. A blizzard is screaming your eulogy just on the other side of the wall, and your very first task of the day, before you can even think of breakfast, before you can relieve yourself, before you can do anything else, is to make damn sure you don't freeze to death in your sleep. You are about to engage in the most important battle of your day, the resurrection of the fire. But before you coax those embers back to life, it's worth asking the most fundamental question of all. Why? Why are you here, Nathaniel? What colossal force, what siren's call, could possibly compel a man to trade the safety and predictability of the civilized East for this brutal, high-stakes bargain with the wilderness? It wasn't just you. It was a generation of young men pouring out of the settled lands like a river breaking its banks. The answer, like most things in history, is a complex tapestry of economics, culture, and raw, untamed ambition. The engine driving this entire mad enterprise was a single, seemingly trivial object of fashion: the beaver felt hat. In the early 19th century, in the drawing rooms of London, the salons of Paris, and the halls of power in Washington, D.C., a man's status was often measured by the quality of his headwear, and the finest, most durable, most waterproof, and most fashionable hats were made from the felt processed from the underfur of the North American beaver. This fur, with its unique interlocking barbed fibers, could be pounded and steamed into a material that was lighter, more resilient, and held its shape better than any other known substance. This insatiable European and American demand created a bubble, an economic frenzy not unlike the gold rushes that would follow. Beaver pelts, referred to as plues by the trappers, became a form of currency on the frontier. A prime, heavy plue could be traded for a staggering amount of goods at the annual rendezvous. A skilled trapper could accumulate a small fortune in a few seasons, enough to return to the East and buy a farm, start a business, and live a life of relative comfort. It was the 19th century equivalent of striking oil. This lure of wealth was amplified by the towering, almost mythical figures of the great fur trading companies. Giants like John Jacob Astor's American Fur Company and their fierce rivals, the Rocky Mountain Fur Company and the British Hudson's Bay Company, were the corporate behemoths of their day. They financed the trapping expeditions, supplied the men with the necessary tools of the trade, the traps, the rifles, the gunpowder, the knives, the blankets, the coffee, the sugar, all at an exorbitant markup, of course. They created a system of debt peonage where a trapper would start the season already owing the company for his supplies, a debt he could only pay off with a successful hunt. It was a system designed to keep the men perpetually bound to the trade, pushing them deeper and deeper into uncharted territory in a relentless search for untapped beaver populations. A sudden, violent, explosive crack from directly outside the shelter makes you freeze, your hand hovering over the woodpile, every muscle tensed. It's the sound of something massive, something impossibly heavy, moving very near your shelter. Your Kentucky long rifle, a beautiful and deadly piece of craftsmanship, is propped in the corner, its long, elegant, octagonal barrel glinting in the faint firelight. But you don't reach for it, not yet. Panic is a luxury you cannot afford. Better to listen, to analyze, to understand. The sound comes again, a deep, groaning, splintering report that seems to shake the very ground. Just a tree branch, you realize, a massive limb burdened by the immense accumulating weight of the new wet snow, finally surrendering to gravity. The tension drains from your shoulders, but only slightly. To live in the mountains is to live in a state of constant, low-level, adrenalized vigilance. Every unexpected sound could be a threat. Every moving shadow could be a predator. Second, after mastering the wind, was the avoidance of the landscape's invisible, silent threats. Avalanches, flash floods, and excessive snow accumulation. You would be shocked, truly shocked, at the number of trappers who died not from cold or starvation or animal attack, but from being buried alive in their own supposedly safe shelters. They were either crushed in an instant by the sudden, thunderous collapse of a roof under a snow load it was never designed to bear, or silently entombed by a massive avalanche they never saw or heard coming. This required a deep, almost geological understanding of the surrounding terrain. Mountain men studied the angles of the slopes above their potential build sites, knowing through hard-won experience that any slope between 30 and 45 degrees was a potential death slide, a loaded gun waiting for the right trigger. They learned to identify the subtle signs of past avalanches, a swath of younger, smaller trees on a hillside, or a pile of old jumbled debris at the base of a gulch. They identified natural wind channels and the formation of cornices on the ridgelines above them, which could create dangerous downdrafts and dump massive, localized snowdrifts that could bury a cabin in a single night. They learned to avoid the absolute bottoms of valleys, where the coldest, densest air settled like a physical weight, creating a cold sink that was nearly impossible to heat. But they also, with equal care, avoided the exposed tops of ridges where the wind would scour them relentlessly, day and night. The ideal site was a delicate, masterful compromise, a location that offered southern exposure to catch the maximum warmth and light from the low winter sun, but which also had robust protection from the prevailing northwesterly winds. It needed reliable access to a water source, like a deep spring, which was far less likely to freeze completely solid than a shallow, fast-moving creek. You vividly remember asking an old Ute elder, a man named Two Elk, whose eyes held the wisdom of 1,000 winters, How the mountain men figured all of this out so quickly. Trial and error, he had said, his face impassive, but with a grim, knowing smile touching the corners of his mouth. Much emphasis on the error. The mountains are patient. They keep the bones of the men who got it wrong. And that was the absolute heart of it. There was no wilderness survival for dummies, no YouTube tutorials. This knowledge was a living, evolving library, passed down orally from one generation of survivors to the next, its pages written with the near misses, the amputated, frostbitten toes, and the fatal, unrecorded mistakes of those who came before. The successful mountain men, the ones who grew old, were the ones who were humble enough and smart enough to learn from the deadly errors of others. You add another small, carefully chosen log to the now growing fire, watching as the hungry flames eagerly lick at the dry, resinous bark. The dancing light illuminates the cramped interior of your shelter, casting long, wavering, ghostly shadows on the log walls. Outside, the wind screams past, a constant, high-pitched banshee wail. Occasionally, with a particularly violent gust, it finds a tiny, undiscovered gap in your chinking, and a knife-like surgical draft of icy air cuts through the relative warmth, a sharp, painful reminder of the existential battle being waged just inches away from your skin. Third on the list of priorities was mastering the ground itself, drainage and foundation. Get your floor wet in winter, Nathaniel. You might as well save time and dig your own grave. Sam's lesson had been, as always, blunt and brutally true. Mountain men religiously selected sites with good natural drainage, on slightly elevated ground, never in a boggy meadow or too close to a riverbank that might flood during a sudden thaw. Before laying the first log, they would meticulously clear the ground of all organic matter, leaves, roots, rich topsoil that could act like a sponge and retain moisture. A damp floor was a relentless enemy. It meant damp gear, damp bedding, and eventually the insidious, creeping, irreversible death of hypothermia. Furthermore, proper drainage prevented the formation of ice lenses in the frozen ground beneath the shelter, which could heave and expand with incredible force, destabilizing the foundation and causing the entire structure to shift, buckle, and even collapse. The fire is truly catching now, a healthy, confident blaze. You can feel its radiant heat beginning to actively push back against the oppressive, ambient cold. Your fingers, which were stiff, numb, and painful just moments ago, are starting to regain sensation. You flex them carefully, slowly, knowing from experience that warming them too quickly can cause excruciating pain as the blood rushes back into the constricted capillaries. Every single action in this world is measured, deliberate, and informed by experience. Survival is not a sprint. It is a marathon of 1,000 tiny, individually insignificant, but collectively vital correct decisions. And the very first and most important of those decisions was made months ago, under a warm, benevolent summer sun, when you and Sam walked this land for 3 full days and finally chose this exact spot, this small, defensible pocket of relative safety in a vast, overwhelming world of danger. Before a single log could be notched or a single stone could be laid, a mountain man had to rely on a small, brutally efficient, and utterly essential set of tools. There were no hardware stores, no supply depots. Everything you needed, you carried with you on a pack mule or cached strategically from the previous season. Your toolkit was an extension of your body, and its quality and your skill with it were direct measures of your chances of survival. To understand the genius of their shelters, you must first understand the humble but powerful tools that gave them form. At the undisputed king of this arsenal was the felling axe. This was not the light, general-purpose axe you might find in a modern suburban garage. This was a heavy, specialized tool, typically with a head weighing between 3 and 5 pounds, attached to a long, straight-grained hickory handle. The bit was relatively narrow and sharp, designed for one purpose: to bite deep into the fibers of a tree and sever them with maximum efficiency. Felling a mature lodgepole pine, a tree that could be over 2 feet in diameter, with nothing but an axe was a feat of incredible physical endurance and precise skill. A novice would waste enormous amounts of energy and dull his axe quickly. An expert like Sam could drop a tree exactly where he wanted it, with a clean, controlled fall that minimized the risk of the tree getting hung up or barber chairing, a terrifying event where the trunk splits vertically and kicks back at the cutter. Once the tree was on the ground, different set of tools came into play. The branches were removed with the same felling axe, a process called limbing. Then the log was bucked to the correct length for the cabin walls. But the real artistry began with shaping the logs. For this, the broadaxe was the essential instrument. Unlike the felling axe, the broadaxe had a very wide chisel-like blade, often beveled on only one side. It was used to hew the round logs into square or flattened timbers. Standing on top of the log, the mountain man would swing the broadaxe in a sweeping, downward motion, slicing off slabs of wood with each pass, slowly transforming the curved surface into a flat plane. This was dangerous, highly skilled work. A single misplaced swing could send the razor-sharp blade into your leg or foot, a potentially fatal injury in this remote environment. The flat interior walls created by this process made the shelter more spacious and easier to chink effectively. For finer shaping, especially on the interior surfaces or for making furniture, the adze was used. This was a tool that looked like a curved axe head mounted perpendicular to the handle, like a hoe. The user would stand astride the log and swing the adze between their legs, scooping out chips of wood with each stroke. It was used to smooth the hewn surfaces, create bowls, or shape the gentle curve of a saddle notch. The distinctive scalloped texture left by an adze is a hallmark of pre-industrial woodworking. To join the logs at the corners, precise notches had to be cut. While much of this was done with a smaller, more controllable hand axe, the auger was often indispensable. This was a large hand-cranked drill bit used to bore holes for wooden pegs, trunnels, that could pin the logs together, especially in the roof structure or around door and window frames. An auger was a heavy, cumbersome tool, but the ability to create strong, peg joints was well worth the effort of hauling it into the high country. For creating roof shingles, a tool called a froe was used. It was a thick, L-shaped blade that was driven into the end grain of a short section of log with a wooden mallet or beetle. By twisting the handle, the user could split off or rive thin, consistent boards or shingles. This technique worked with the natural grain of the wood, producing shingles that were surprisingly strong and water-resistant. Finally, for peeling bark and for fine-tuning the fit of notches and joints, the draw knife was essential. This was a long, straight blade with a handle at each end. The user would pull or draw the blade towards them, shaving off thin curls of wood with each pass. It was a tool of finesse and precision, the final touch in a process that began with the raw, brutal power of the felling axe. You remember the long, arduous days of the late summer, working alongside Sam to build this very shelter. The rhythmic thump, thump, thump of his felling axe echoing through the valley, the satisfying sheeing of his broad axe slicing through pine, the meticulous, patient work with the draw knife, ensuring each notch was a perfect, airtight fit. These were not just tools of construction, they were the instruments through which knowledge and intention were transformed into the physical reality of survival. Without them, and the hard-won skill to use them effectively, all the knowledge in the world about site selection and thermal dynamics would be utterly useless. The fire is now a steady, crackling, vibrant presence, a living heart pumping warmth into the chest of your small shelter. You settle back onto your sleeping platform, pulling a single heavy buffalo robe around your shoulders like a cloak. The immediate life or death crisis of the dying fire has been averted, but the long, grinding war against the mountain winter is only just beginning. Your continued existence, night after night, depends entirely on the structural integrity of this small wooden box, on the myriad decisions made and the backbreaking work performed months ago, when the weather was fair, the sun was warm, and winter was just a distant, abstract threat on the far horizon. Let's talk about the actual engineering. And yes, it was most certainly engineering, even if the uneducated men who practiced it with such mastery would have just called it common sense. It was a complex set of unwritten principles, a school of structural design tested not in a university laboratory with scales and models, but in the unforgiving, full-scale crucible of the Rocky Mountains, where failure was absolute and final. First and foremost came the meticulous, almost obsessive, snow load calculations. There were no calculators, no slide rules, no structural engineering degrees, just a vast body of empirical knowledge, gained through decades of observing what worked, what bent, and what catastrophically failed. Mountain men understood, in a way that modern city dwellers cannot possibly comprehend, that the roofs of their shelters needed to support immense, almost unbelievable weights. A light, fluffy snow might weigh only a few pounds per cubic foot, but a heavy, wet, compacted snow can easily weigh over 20 pounds per cubic foot. A multi-day blizzard, like the one currently raging, could dump several feet of it, creating a uniform load of up to 100 pounds per square foot, several tons of weight pressing down on the small roof. Add to that the unpredictable dynamic forces of the wind, which could create massive, uneven drifts and loading patterns, and you have a perfect recipe for a sudden, fatal structural collapse. They designed their roof angles with a brilliant, intuitive precision. Build your roof too flat, boy. The snow piles up, gets heavy, and crushes you in your sleep. Your mentor's voice echoes in your memory. A lesson delivered on the very day you helped hoist the main ridgepole for this shelter. Build it too steep, the wind gets under the eaves and tears the whole damn thing off like a leaf in a hurricane. There's a sweet spot, a magic angle, right in between. And you better find it before the first big storm does. That sweet spot, that magic angle refined over generations, was typically a roof pitch between 30 and 45 degrees. This was steep enough to encourage heavy snow to shed under its own weight, especially on a sunny day following a storm, but not so steep as to become a sail, catching the full force of the hurricane-strength winds that regularly scoured the high country. Then came the critical selection of the logs themselves. This was not a simple matter of walking into the woods and cutting down the nearest available trees. It was a process as careful and deliberate as a master craftsman selecting his materials. What most of these new fellas from the East get wrong, Sam once mused, spitting a stream of tobacco juice, is they think any log will do. But choosing the wrong wood is exactly like choosing the wrong horse for a long, hard journey. It'll carry you for a while, but it'll let you down precisely when you need it most, and it will get you killed. They had a strong preference for lodgepole pine and Douglas fir, trees known for their high strength-to-weight ratios, their inherent resistance to rot, and their tendency to grow exceptionally straight, but not just any pine or fir would do. They sought out trees that were dead but still standing, known colloquially as standing dead, which had already been perfectly seasoned by the air and the sun, their moisture content low and stable. Cutting green, living wood was a catastrophic rookie mistake. As greenwood dried over the first winter, it would shrink, warp, and twist with incredible force, opening up huge, unsealable gaps in the walls. These gaps would become conduits for the cold, rendering the shelter almost useless. Wood that was too old and had fallen, on the other hand, was often riddled with rot and insects, lacking the necessary structural integrity. Each log was selected with purpose, its size, straightness, and condition carefully assessed, its future role in the structure. The blizzard outside intensifies again, its voice rising to a demonic shriek. You feel a slight but perceptible vibration through the floorboards, a testament to the immense, invisible forces being exerted on your small, wooden fortress. In this moment, you are profoundly grateful for the solid, interlocking walls surrounding you, for the deep, hard-won knowledge that went into selecting each individual log, notching each precise joint, and carefully placing each unmortared foundation stone. Finally, the entire process of material procurement and preparation was a rigid, unforgiving, seasonal science. The ideal time to cut trees was in the late fall or early winter, when the sap content in the wood was at its absolute lowest. This made the wood more stable, less prone to rot, and less attractive to wood-boring insects. The logs, once felled and bucked to length, would then be meticulously peeled of their bark, a laborious task that prevented moisture from being trapped against the wood, and then seasoned. They were stacked with air gaps between them and left to dry naturally for months, sometimes for a full year, to prevent the cracking, checking, and settling that plagued the hasty constructions of amateurs. All of this backbreaking work, from selecting the perfect site to peeling the bark off the last roof log, had to be completed during the brutally short mountain summer and fall. Winter in the high country did not forgive procrastination. You settle back onto your sleeping platform, pulling the heavy, comforting weight of the buffalo robes around you again. The fire crackles pleasantly, a beacon of warmth and defiance against the raging, elemental chaos outside. As you feel yourself drifting back towards a fitful, shallow sleep, you think about the incredible, invisible library of knowledge that is embodied in the simple, solid structure around you. The careful, prophetic site selection, the precise, intuitive engineering of the roof, the specific, purpose-chosen materials, the flexible, living foundation that moves with the breathing earth. None of it was random, all of it was essential. And tomorrow, if you survive the long, dark night, you will need to apply that same level of sophisticated, life or death knowledge to the shelter's most critical and most complex component, its heating system. Because keeping the relentless cold out was only half the battle. The other, more difficult half was creating, managing, and sustaining the precious, life-giving warmth within. The fire pops loudly, sending a brilliant spark dancing across the dark dirt floor. It dies in an instant, but not before reminding you of the central, inescapable, terrifying truth of mountain life. Fire is life, and in the mountains, life is never, ever guaranteed. You are woken from a deep sleep by the sound of absolute, profound silence. After days of the blizzard's relentless, maddening howl, the quiet is so complete it is almost unsettling. A void where a constant pressure used to be. A pale, ethereal blue light filters through the small window, the unmistakable, crystal-clear light of dawn in the high mountains after a massive snowfall. The air inside your shelter is cold, a sharp, clean cold, but it is not the deadly, life-threatening cold of a dead fire. Though the flames have once again burned down to a deep bed of glowing embers during the long night, the incredible thermal mass of the massive stone fireplace has done its sacred job, slowly and consistently bleeding stored heat into the room all night, keeping the ambient temperature from plummeting into the danger zone. Your first conscious thought is of the critical roof repair you performed yesterday. You look up at the spot on the ceiling that had been ominously leaking. It is completely dry. Your quick, decisive fix has held through the night. Your second thought is far more pressing and immediate. The indoor woodpile, once a proud and comforting monument to preparedness, is now dangerously, frighteningly low. The storm has finally passed, but its consequences and challenges remain. Today, without fail, you must venture out into the newly transformed world to replenish your fuel supply. In the brutal economy of the mountain winter, running out of firewood is the equivalent of bankruptcy, a death sentence from which there is no appeal. But what if things had gone truly, catastrophically wrong? What if the blizzard hadn't passed? What if your chimney, weakened by the relentless wind, had collapsed in the middle of the night? What if your roof, despite your best efforts, had finally succumbed to the immense weight of the snow and caved in? This day-to-day existence of maintenance and resource gathering required constant, grinding vigilance. But the true masters of mountain survival, the men who lived to old age, were defined not by how they handled the routine, but by their unflappable readiness for total, catastrophic system failure. Martha Caldwell, a homesteader's wife, faced exactly that unimaginable scenario during the legendary Great Blizzard of 1856. Their chimney, improperly and hastily built by a well-meaning but inexperienced neighbor, collapsed under the unprecedented snow load, instantly turning their primary life-giving heating system into a gaping, roaring hole to the storm. Her husband, Jacob, was away on a long trapping line. She and her three small, terrified children were completely alone. Her diary entry from that harrowing week is a chilling, stark testament to human resilience. The crash came at the stroke of midnight, a thunderous, grinding roar of falling stones, and a sudden, violent avalanche of snow pouring down where our warm, comforting hearth had been just moments before. The cold rushed in like a hungry, tangible wolf, a physical presence that stole the breath from our lungs. I gathered the children into the corner of the cabin furthest from the breach, piling every buffalo robe, every wool blanket, every scrap of cloth we possessed upon them. And then, through the fog of my terror, I remembered Jacob's lessons, the lessons about the emergency heat. Those lessons, a body of knowledge passed down from veteran, hardened mountain men to her husband, saved her family's life. With the main fireplace gone, she implemented a series of backup heating procedures, created emergency ventilation channels to prevent suffocation, and utilized a host of other survival techniques that kept her small family alive for 6 brutal days until the storm finally passed and repairs could be made. You begin to pull on your many layers of clothing, preparing for your own wood-gathering expedition. As you dress, you methodically, mentally, review your own emergency protocols, the ones Sam had drilled into you with a relentless, unforgiving intensity. Emergency heating systems. What was the protocol if your fireplace failed catastrophically? The very first line of defense was extreme body heat conservation. You had your layers of wool and buckskin clothing, and the thick, insulating pile of buffalo robes. Sam had taught you the critical technique of how to build a small, improvised shelter within the larger compromised shelter. Cleared the smallest, most defensible corner I could, he had recounted, telling the story of a time his own cabin roof had partially collapsed under a record snowfall. Used the fallen timbers, the broken furniture, anything I could find to make a tiny, tent-like structure, hung blankets and hides over it to make the space even smaller, no bigger than a coffin, pulled on every last stitch of clothing I owned. Then I just sat there, huddled in that little cocoon, and waited. Your body puts out a surprising amount of heat. A small enough space keeps it close to you. I survived for 3 full days like that until I could dig my way out and make the necessary repairs. Beyond that ultimate desperate measure, you had your cache of heatable stones, which as a secondary system could provide localized, life-sustaining warmth for many hours. Emergency fuel procurement. As you gather your heavy felling axe and a small, sturdy hand sled, you think about the terrifying scenario where your primary woodpile was buried by an avalanche or, even worse, destroyed by a fire. The true survivor always knew how to find and prepare emergency fuel. Deadfall wood, of course, was the first choice. But beyond that, they knew that dry, standing bark stripped from certain species of trees, hardened clumps of sagebrush, or even tightly packed bundles of pine cones could be burned in a pinch to produce life-saving heat. Had to get real creative once, Sam had chuckled, telling a story of an early foolish winter where an avalanche had completely buried his entire, meticulously stacked wood supply. I started burning everything wooden in that cabin that wasn't holding up the roof. Spare tool handles, a broken snowshoe frame, even the damn chair I had carved. I survived by thinking beyond the idea of a traditional woodpile. You step outside. The world is utterly transformed, reborn. It is buried under a thick, pristine, almost blindingly white blanket of new snow. The cold hits you like a physical blow, instantly numbing any exposed skin. The sky above is a painful, achingly brilliant blue, and the morning sun glitters off the endless field of snow crystals with a blinding, disorienting intensity. You must first clear a path from your own door. You grab the heavy wooden snow shovel that hangs on pegs beside the entrance and begin the arduous task of digging out. The new snow is deep, waist-high in places, but it is light and powdery, making the work less strenuous than it could have been. Still, in this extreme cold, any physical exertion makes you sweat, a deceptively dangerous situation. You pace yourself, digging for a few minutes and then resting, allowing the cold air to cool you, preventing the buildup of dangerous moisture in your clothing. With a usable path cleared, you strap on your freshly repaired snowshoes, your passports to mobility in this deep snow world, and head toward a familiar stand of dead timber about 100 yards from your shelter. As you trudge through the deep powder, your snowshoes keeping you afloat, you select your targets carefully. Dead standing timber is the best, as it's already seasoned by the elements but not yet rotten. Greenwood burns poorly, producing excessive smoke and little heat. Wood that's been on the ground for too long absorbs moisture from the snow and becomes nearly impossible to light. As you turn back toward your shelter with the first heavy load of wood on your sled, you notice something that makes you pause, your heart suddenly beating faster. Fresh tracks in the new snow, about 50 yards to your right. Wolf tracks, and big ones. The tracks of a large lone male. A stark, visceral reminder that the cold is not the only active danger in these mountains. You hurry back to your shelter, unload the wood, and make two more tense, watchful gathering trips before deciding you have enough to last for several days. The presence of the wolf now weighs heavily on your mind. A hungry wolf pack in the deep of winter can be bold enough to attack a lone human, but a lone wolf is often more unpredictable and potentially more dangerous. Back inside your sanctuary, with the heavy door securely latched, you add some of the new wood to the fire and gratefully warm your hands. The shelter had cooled significantly during your absence, but it quickly warms again as the fire builds. You remove your outer layers, hanging them near the hearth to dry any sweat that accumulated during your hard work. With the wood-gathering expedition successful, your thoughts turn to other potential emergencies. Structural failure protocols. As you sip hot pine needle tea, you meticulously scan the roof and walls of your shelter from the inside, checking for any new signs of stress or strain from the recent, immense snow load. The roof's steep, well-designed angle has allowed most of the snow to slide off, preventing a dangerous accumulation. The heavy walls show no signs of bowing or cracking. Your shelter, your partner in survival, has weathered the great blizzard well. But what if it hadn't? What if, like Sam's old cabin or the Caldwell family's chimney, some critical part of your shelter had failed during the storm? Experienced mountain men had established protocols for this as well. They developed emergency repair techniques that used materials and tools that were readily available, even during severe weather conditions. In a dedicated corner of your shelter, you keep your emergency repair kit, a small, tightly wrapped bundle containing extra chinking material, a long coil of strong Rahid cordage, a small sharp buck saw, several pre-carved wooden wedges, and other essential tools that would allow you to make critical, life-saving fixes even in the worst imaginable conditions. Being prepared for a potential structural failure could mean the difference between life and death. When my main roof beam started to go that one winter, Sam had told you once, his eyes distant with the memory, I didn't panic. Panic is a luxury you can't afford. I grabbed those heavy support poles I always keep cut and ready for just such an occasion. I braced the sagging section of the roof, then I packed snow on top of some spare hides to seal the new gaps. It wasn't pretty, but it kept me alive and dry until the storm passed, and I could get outside to make the proper, permanent repairs. He understood that emergency repairs were often a desperate race against time, and that having both the materials and the knowledge ready to go was the key to winning that race. But what if the damage was too severe for any kind of repair? What if the shelter became completely, catastrophically uninhabitable? There was always the ultimate backup plan, the shelter of last resort. Backup shelter construction. The most common and effective backup shelter was the snow cave, a remarkable survival shelter that could be created in any deep snowdrift using nothing more than a knife, a small shovel, or even just your hands. A properly constructed snow cave, with an entrance tunnel that curves upwards into a raised sleeping chamber, can maintain an interior temperature at or near freezing, even when the outside temperatures drop to 30 or 40 degrees below zero. It's cold to be sure, but it is survivable. Sam had described building one when his very first mountain cabin, a poorly built affair from his greenhorn days, had burned to the ground in the middle of a January night. Dug like a panicked badger into a big, deep drift on the lee side of a hill, he had said. Made an entrance tunnel that curved up so the cold air would stay trapped in the entrance. Carved out a sleeping chamber just big enough for my body, about the size of a large dog kennel. My own body heat, trapped in that small insulated space, brought the temperature up just enough to keep me from freezing to death. I lived in that snow hole for 11 days until I could fell new trees and build a proper shelter. It wasn't comfortable, but I'm here to tell the tale. The old mountain man's story highlights a critical, central aspect of mountain survival. Always have a backup plan. Primary shelters might fail. Primary heating systems might become compromised. In those extreme situations, Having the knowledge and the will to quickly and effectively implement an alternative often meant the difference between life and death. You stoke the fire again, adding a larger, denser log of oak that will burn slowly for hours. The interior of your shelter is warm now, almost comfortable, but your mind remains focused on emergency preparations. There were still more protocols to consider, more dangers to anticipate. The mountains demanded nothing less than total, constant preparedness. The price of complacency was absolute. Chapter 7. The Unseen Shield. The Science of Weatherproofing. The soft, gray, diffused light of dawn seeps through the single small window. A crude but effective square opening covered not with expensive and fragile glass, but with a thinly scraped, stretched, and oiled animal bladder. It's a remarkable translucent membrane that lets in a surprising amount of light while remaining flexible and impervious to the wind. You've slept better than you expected. A deep, restorative, almost hibernation-like sleep, thanks to the steady, radiant heat that bled from the stone fireplace all night and the heavy insulating cocoon of your buffalo robes. But something is immediately, jarringly wrong. There is a subtle but unmistakable dampness to the air that wasn't there before you slept. A palpable increase in the humidity that your senses, now honed to a razor's edge by months of wilderness living, register as an immediate, flashing red alarm. Dampness in a mountain shelter during the deep of winter isn't just a minor inconvenience or a matter of discomfort. It is a potential death warrant. Where there is dampness, there is an unseen breach in your weatherproofing. And where there is a breach, the killing, predatory cold can and will follow. A single drop of ice-cold water lands squarely on the back of your hand. You flinch as if struck. Your eyes snap upwards in the dim light. The ceiling, a sturdy structure made of split logs and a thick layer of packed earth and sod, is showing a small, dark, ominous wet spot. It's no bigger than your palm, but it's growing, visibly darkening as you watch. The immense weight of snow piling up on your roof is being slowly but surely melted from below by the constant, rising heat of your fire. That meltwater, instead of running off, has found a tiny, insidious, treacherous gap in your roof's multi-layered defenses. It is seeping through. If left unchecked, that steady, rhythmic drip, drip, drip will become a relentless, water torture-like nemesis. It will soak your bedding, your clothes, your precious food stores, your gear, and eventually you. In the sub-zero temperatures of the high Rockies, wet means dead. It's a simple, brutal, and unforgiving equation of physics. The Henderson family, greenhorns from Ohio, learned this the hard way. During their first ill-prepared Rocky Mountain winter of 1842, their poorly sealed, amateurishly constructed cabin became a horrifying death trap of interior ice. Jonathan Henderson, the patriarch, wrote with a trembling hand in his journal, "We burned every stick of wood we possessed, and still the cold penetrated our very bones like 1,000 tiny knives. The moisture from our own breath, from our cooking, from our bodies, froze in glittering, crystalline sheets on the inside of the walls. We huddled together as one, shivering uncontrollably, watching with a growing terror as ice formed on the edges of our blankets as we slept." 3 years later, that same family shelter was described by a passing, experienced trapper as being as dry, warm, and comfortable as a parson's study, even during the worst blizzards the mountains could muster. What changed in those 3 years? They had mastered the mountain man's unwritten, but absolutely critical, science of weatherproofing. You swing your legs over the edge of the sleeping platform, grabbing your thick buckskin shirt and pulling it over your head. Survival priority one, always and forever, is the fire. You stoke it, adding more wood until the flames rise high and strong, aggressively pushing back the damp morning chill. But that insidious leak is now survival priority number two. It needs to be located and fixed now, before it can escalate into a full-blown crisis. Wall construction and the science of chinking were the first and most obvious line of defense against the elements. As you look at the solid walls around you, you see more than just a pile of logs. You see an integrated intelligence system. The logs, you remember, were fitted with incredible, painstaking precision. the deep saddle notches creating tight, overlapping joints that minimize the gaps between them. But it was the chinking that truly transformed a pile of wood into a weatherproof fortress. You run your calloused hand along the wall near the leak. The chinking isn't just dried mud, which would crack and crumble. It's Sam's special, time-tested mixture of a specific type of sticky clay. Long strands of dried grass for tensile strength, and coarse buffalo hair as a binder and additional insulator. This created a remarkable composite material that provided a flexible, breathable, yet remarkably waterproof seal. You know what really kills most of these greenhorns their first winter? Sam had asked you once, his voice full of a grim certainty. It's not the cold directly. It's not the natives. It's not even the wolves or the grizzlies. It's the tiny little insignificant gaps between their logs, the spaces they never even noticed back in the warm, forgiving summer that turn into deadly heat-sucking wind tunnels come the deep freeze of January. You grab the small, rickety wooden ladder leaning against one wall and position it carefully under the growing damp spot. Climbing up, your face now inches from the ceiling, you get a much closer look at the problem. A small section of the interior roof covering, split logs laid flat, has clearly shifted or worked loose, most likely vibrated out of position by the relentless, days-long assault of the blizzard's winds. That's all it takes for water to find a path. Roof systems in the high country were brilliantly designed to handle a dual, often contradictory threat: the immense weight of snow and the insidious infiltration of water. The steep angle of your roof was designed to shed the bulk of the dry, powdery snow, preventing a dangerous, crushing load from accumulating. But the waterproofing was a sophisticated, multi-layered affair, a sort of 19th century roofing membrane. First, a sturdy primary layer of tightly fitted split logs. On top of that, a secondary overlapping layer of bark shingles, often harvested in large sheets from aspen or birch trees, laid to overlap like the scales on a fish, so that water would always be directed downwards. And finally, a thick, heavy layer of sod or packed earth, which provided both a surprising amount of insulation and the necessary weight to hold all the lighter components down against the lifting force of the wind. It was, in effect, a living roof, a complex integrated system designed to shed water and snow perfectly. But nothing built by human hands is perfect forever. You climb back down the ladder. To fix this properly, you will have to go outside, into the tail end of the storm. It's not a pleasant prospect, but it is a non-negotiable one. First, however, you need the right materials. From a damp, cool corner of the shelter, you retrieve a small wooden bucket containing your pre-made chinking mixture, kept pliable by a small amount of water. Good chinking, Sam had told you once, watching you clumsily trying to repair a seam in your buckskin shirt, is just like good stitching. If it's too loose, all the bad stuff gets through. If it's too tight, it tears when things stretch and move. It's got to be just right, with a little give to it. You begin the ritual of preparing for the outdoors. You pull on your heaviest coat, the thick wool capote. You wrap a woolen scarf around your face, covering your nose and mouth. You pull on thick, fur-lined, waterproof mittens. You grab your trusty wooden shovel and a small leather bag containing your repair materials. Taking a deep, fortifying breath, you unlatch and open the heavy door. A thick, solid slab of wood hung on sturdy, silent leather hinges. Instantly, a blast of Arctic air and a swirl of fine, stinging snow rushes in. A violent, unwelcome invasion of the outside world. You step out quickly, pulling the heavy door shut behind you, the solid thump of the latch a comforting sound. The cold is a physical shock, a brutal force that seems to knock the very breath from your lungs. Even through all your carefully chosen layers, you can feel it probing, testing, searching for any seam, any weakness. This is the cold that freezes exposed flesh solid in a matter of minutes. The snow has drifted nearly to the roof on the windward side of your shelter, creating a natural, highly effective insulating barrier. On the leeward side, the side you need to work on, the snow is only about 3 feet deep. You wade through it, the fine powder flying up with each laborious step, and circle around to the back of the shelter. Looking up, you can now see the problem clearly from the outside. A small section of the uppermost sod layer has been completely scoured away by the wind, exposing the bark shingles below. One of those shingles has been lifted and dislodged by the wind, creating the very gap where the meltwater is now seeping through. You use the shovel to clear a wide, stable area of snow from the base of the shelter, creating a safe, solid platform for your ladder. Then you begin to climb, your fingers already beginning to stiffen and ache in the bitter cold, despite the thick mittens. 3 minutes, Nathaniel. 3 minutes. Sam's voice is a phantom instructor, a ghostly presence in the howling wind. That's how long you have to work with your bare hands in this kind of cold before your fingers stop working right, before they get clumsy and stupid. Count it out. Plan your moves. Get the job done and get back inside before your hands become useless, frozen clubs. You're working with your mittens on, which helps immensely, but still the cold is a creeping, insidious, numbing force, working its way through the leather and fur. The repair itself is straightforward, but it must be executed with a brutal, focused efficiency. You press the loose bark shingle back into its proper, overlapping position. Then, working quickly, you apply a thick, generous layer of your fresh, chinking mixture all around its edges, creating a new, durable seal. The sticky clay mixture is already starting to stiffen and freeze in the cold air, but you smooth it into place with your gloved hands, your movements practiced and certain. The Yache Mazuri job is done. You pack up your materials, descend the ladder, and hurry back around to the safety of the door, your face stinging and numb from just those few precious minutes of exposure. Back inside, the calm, dry warmth of the shelter wraps around you like a physical embrace. You hang your snow-covered coat near the fire to dry and carefully, slowly, warm your hands, flexing your fingers to restore circulation and sensation. You look up at the ceiling. The dark, wet spot has already stopped growing. Your rapid, decisive repair is holding. This small but potentially deadly incident highlights the constant, unending vigilance required for mountain survival. Weatherproofing maintenance was not a seasonal chore. It was a daily, ongoing battle. An hour of preventative maintenance in good weather could save a day of misery or even your life in bad weather. You move around the interior of your shelter, your senses now on high alert, running your hand along the seams between the logs, feeling for the slightest hint of a draft. Near the doorframe, you feel it, a slight, almost imperceptible movement of cold air. Another small developing gap in the chinking that needs to be sealed. You take a small dab of the chinking mixture and press it firmly into the gap from the inside, smoothing it flat with your thumb. Now take a moment to consider the door and window systems. Your door is not just a piece of wood, it's a solid 2-inch thick slab of split log fitted with incredible precision into its heavy frame. Around its edges, strips of soft rabbit fur have been tacked on to create a perfect gasket, blocking any and all drafts. Your small window, covered with that oiled animal bladder, is another potential weak point. But it too is sealed tightly into its frame with a mixture of pine pitch and clay. Some of the larger, more permanent mountain man forts even built primitive but highly effective airlocks or mudrooms, a small, unheated antechamber between the outer door and the inner door. This simple design prevented the massive, catastrophic rush of cold air from entering the main living space every time someone went in or out. Finally, there's the all-important but often overlooked ventilation system. As we've discussed, a shelter that doesn't breathe will kill you. The carbon monoxide from an open fire is a silent, odorless, and highly efficient poison. But too much ventilation, and you might as well be living outside, as all your precious, hard-won heat will escape. The elegant solution was an adjustable ventilation opening, usually a small, simple wooden flap or a piece of hide covering a hole near the peak of the roof. You check it now, making sure it's adjusted properly for the current conditions. Open just enough to allow the smoke and gases to escape, but not so open that it's a gaping highway for your heat to leave. The repair work, though brief, has made you hungry. From a leather pouch hanging on the wall, you take a strip of dried, smoked venison. As you chew the tough, flavorful meat, you look around at your small, personal fortress. The carefully constructed log walls, the meticulously maintained chinking, the strategically designed multi-layered roof with its precise angle for snow shedding, the solid gasket-sealed door, the small covered window that admits precious light without wasting. Precious heat, all of it working in perfect, harmonious concert to create this tiny, life-sustaining bubble of warmth and dryness in the very midst of a frozen, hostile, and utterly indifferent world. All of it a living testament to the accumulated, hard-won knowledge of the unheralded geniuses who came before you. The blizzard continues to rage outside, its power undiminished, but for now, your shield is holding. Your fortress is secure. With the shelter secured and the fire burning bright, the relentless, fundamental demands of the human body take center stage. A warm, dry shelter is useless if the man inside it starves to death. Winter sustenance was a science in itself, a complex and unforgiving discipline that required an intimate knowledge of animal behavior, a mastery of primitive technology, and a profound understanding of food preservation. Your life depends on the calories you can find, trap, and store. The primary source of winter food was, of course, meat. Large game like elk, deer, or bison were the ultimate prize. A single successful elk hunt in the late fall could provide hundreds of pounds of meat, enough to see a man through a significant portion of the winter. But hunting large game in the deep snow was incredibly difficult and energy-intensive. The animals were scarce, often having migrated to lower, more sheltered valleys. Tracking them in the snow was easy, but getting close enough for a clean shot with a muzzle-loading rifle, without exhausting yourself, was a monumental challenge. Therefore, the workhorse of winter survival was the trap line. Trapping was a more passive, energy-efficient method of securing the small, steady supply of protein and fat needed to fuel your internal furnace. Your trap line is not a random collection of traps. It is a carefully planned and strategically placed system. You focus your efforts on the snowshoe hare and the ptarmigan, creatures well adapted to the winter environment. For the hares, you use a combination of snares and deadfalls. The snares are simple but deadly effective. You fashion a loop from a thin, strong piece of rawhide or sinew and suspend it at head height on a known rabbit trail. The trails are easy to spot in the snow, packed down runways between thickets of willow and alder, the bark of which is the hare's primary winter food. A well-placed snare, attached to a bent sapling that acts as a spring, can catch a hare without you ever being present. The deadfall trap is more complex but equally effective. It consists of a heavy log or flat stone, propped up by an intricate trigger mechanism made of carved sticks. A small piece of bait, a willow twig, a dab of salted fat, is placed on the trigger. When the animal nibbles the bait, it releases the trigger and the heavy weight falls, killing it instantly. Building a reliable deadfall trigger, one that is sensitive enough to be sprung by a small animal, but not so sensitive that it's set off by the wind or falling snow, is a true art form. You spend a portion of each clear day checking your trap line, a circuit that might take several hours on snowshoes. Some days the traps are empty, a disheartening but common occurrence. Other days you are rewarded with a fat snowshoe hare, its pure white winter coat a marvel of natural camouflage. Every catch is a small victory, a deposit in your bank of calories. But meat alone is not enough. The mountain men learned a hard lesson about rabbit starvation, a condition where a diet of extremely lean meat, like that of a winter rabbit, can actually lead to malnutrition and death. The body needs fat to metabolize protein and to provide the dense caloric energy required to fight the cold. Beaver was a prized source of fat, its tail a fatty delicacy. But if large game or beaver were not available, you had to find other sources. You render the fat from every animal you catch, no matter how small. You store it in a small pot and add a spoonful to your stews, a vital supplement that your body craves. Food preservation was the cornerstone that made long-term survival possible. When you were lucky enough to kill a large animal, it was a race against time and predators to process and preserve the meat. The primary method was drying. You would slice the meat into thin, long strips and hang it on racks inside your shelter, near but not too close to the fire. The combination of the dry air and the gentle heat would slowly dehydrate the meat, creating jerky. The smoke from the fire would also permeate the meat, acting as a preservative and adding flavor. The most sophisticated and important preserved food was pemmican. This was the ultimate survival ration, a superfood invented and perfected by the Native American tribes of the plains and passed on to the mountain men. To make pemmican, you would pound the dried jerky into a fine, almost powder-like consistency. You would then mix this powdered meat with an equal amount of hot rendered fat, usually from bison or bear. Often, dried berries like choke cherries or service berries were added for flavor and vitamins. This mixture was then packed tightly into rawhide bags, called parfleche. As the fat cooled, it would solidify, creating a dense, energy-rich, and incredibly shelf-stable food source. Pemmican could last for years without spoiling and provided a perfect balance of protein, fat, and carbohydrates. A small handful could sustain a man for a full day of hard travel. Your emergency food cache, the one you never touch except in the direst of circumstances, is a small bag of pemmican that you and Sam made last fall. Its presence is a profound psychological comfort, a guarantee that you can survive for at least a week, even if all other food sources disappear. Finally, there was winter foraging. The mountains in winter seem barren, but for the knowledgeable eye, there are still sources of nutrition. You know to look for the bright red rose hips still clinging to their thorny bushes, a surprisingly potent source of vitamin C. You know how to identify certain species of pine and fir, and how to carefully peel back the outer bark to access the inner bark, or cambium layer. This thin, greenish-white layer is edible and rich in sugars and starches. It can be eaten raw or roasted over the fire until it's crispy like a cracker. It's not delicious, but it can keep you from starving. And of course, there is your daily pine needle tea, the simplest and most effective defense against the scourge of scurvy. The winter larder is not a pantry filled with goods from a store. It is a dynamic living system, a constant interplay of knowledge, effort, and luck. It is the daily, grinding, but deeply satisfying work of wresting life and sustenance from a world that seems, at first glance, to offer only cold and snow. Each successful trap, each strip of jerky, each cup of tea is a small but vital victory in the long campaign of winter survival. In the unforgiving world of the mountain man, there were no doctors, no clinics, no sterile operating rooms. Your own knowledge of the human body and the natural remedies the wilderness provided was your only defense against injury and illness. A simple infection, a deep cut, or a broken bone, minor issues in the civilized world, were often death sentences in the high country. Wilderness medicine was a brutal, pragmatic, and often painful discipline, a blend of folk wisdom, Native American knowledge, and grim necessity. This morning, as you are splitting firewood just outside the shelter, it happens. A moment of carelessness, your mind wandering to the wolf tracks you saw yesterday, and the axe glances off a knot in the wood. It's not a direct blow, but the sharpened pole of the axe head strikes your left shin, a glancing but powerful impact. It doesn't break the skin through your thick buckskin leggings, but a searing, white-hot pain shoots up your leg. You drop the axe and stumble back, cursing your momentary lapse in concentration. Back inside the shelter, you carefully pull up your legging. A large, angry, purplish welt is already forming on your shin. The bone is not broken, you can put weight on it, but it's a significant deep tissue bruise, a contusion that will swell and stiffen, making movement painful for days. In this environment, any impairment to your mobility is a serious threat. Your first response is immediate and instinctual, based on Sam's teachings. Cold therapy. You go back outside, scoop up a handful of clean, fresh snow, and pack it into a small piece of hide. You press this makeshift ice pack against the swelling injury. The intense cold is painful at first, but you know it will constrict the blood vessels, reduce the internal bleeding, and limit the swelling. You hold it there until the cold becomes unbearable, then remove it, wait for the skin to warm, and repeat the process. For the next few days, you will have to favor the leg, moving slowly and deliberately. But what if the injury had been worse? What if the axe had broken the skin? Wound care was the most critical medical skill a mountain man could possess. An open wound was an open invitation to infection, a condition they called blood poisoning, which was almost invariably fatal. The first step was to stop the bleeding. For most cuts, Direct pressure was sufficient. For a severe arterial bleed, they knew to use a tourniquet, a tight band of cloth or leather twisted with a stick applied above the wound. They understood this was a desperate temporary measure that could lead to the loss of the limb. The next and most important step was cleaning the wound. They would use whatever clean water they could find, often boiled and cooled, to flush out any dirt, wood splinters, or cloth fibers. They also used natural antiseptics. A strong tea brewed from the leaves of the yarrow plant was a common wash for wounds. The tannins in the plant helped to stop bleeding and had mild antiseptic properties. A poultice made from the crushed leaves of plantain, a common weed, was another effective field dressing, known for its ability to draw out infection and soothe inflammation. To close a large wound, they would use primitive sutures. The preferred material was sinew, the strong, fibrous tendon from the back of a deer or elk, which could be split into fine, strong threads. The needle was often a sharpened piece of bone or a large, sturdy thorn. It was an agonizingly painful procedure, performed without anesthetic, but it was far preferable to leaving a large wound gaping open to infection. If a wound did become infected, showing the telltale signs of redness, swelling, pus, and red streaks running up the limb, the treatments became more desperate. They would often use a red-hot knife or arrowhead to cauterize the infected tissue, burning it away in an attempt to stop the spread of the infection. They would also use poultices made from substances like chewed willow bark, a natural source of salicylic acid, the active ingredient in aspirin, or a paste made from clay and charcoal to try and draw out the pus. These were often last-ditch efforts, and their success rate was tragically low. Frostbite was another constant and terrifying threat. They knew the signs: skin that turned white and waxy, a feeling of numbness, and a wooden texture. The worst thing you could do, as many greenhorns learned the hard way, was to rub the frozen tissue or expose it to intense, direct heat. The correct treatment, as Sam had drilled into you, was slow, gradual rewarming. You would immerse the frostbitten part in lukewarm water, never hot, or hold it against the warm skin of your own chest or armpit. The rewarming process was excruciatingly painful as the ice crystals in the cells melted and circulation returned, but it was the only way to save the tissue. Other common ailments had their own folk remedies. Snow blindness, a painful temporary blindness caused by the sun's glare on the snow, was treated by resting in the darkness of the shelter with a cool, damp cloth over the eyes. Some would even place thin slices of potato, if they had them, on their eyelids. For pain and fever, the aforementioned willow bark tea was the standard treatment. For digestive issues, a tea made from mint or ginger root was used. As you sit by the fire, nursing your bruised shin, you feel a renewed sense of the profound fragility of your existence here. Your body is the most important tool you possess, and its maintenance is your most critical task. This minor injury is a potent reminder of the constant vigilance required not just in your actions, but in your attention. In the mountains, a single moment of distraction can have consequences that last for the rest of your very short life. You make a solemn vow to be more careful, to honor the razor-thin margin between survival and disaster. A full week has now passed since the great blizzard finally blew itself out. You have settled into the deep, quiet, and profound rhythm of high-country winter. The days have taken on a predictable, almost monastic structure, a cycle of essential, life-sustaining tasks. You tend the fire, you check your trap lines, you gather more wood, you meticulously maintain the shelter, you repair your heavily used gear. But as these immense physical challenges become routine, a new, more insidious, and far more dangerous opponent begins to emerge from the shadows of your mind: the crushing, profound, and soul-wearying loneliness. The silence. Physical survival, you have come to realize, was only half of the great battle. Psychological survival, the desperate daily struggle to maintain your sanity and your will to live during months of extended, absolute isolation and extreme, unrelenting stress, was the other, often more difficult, half. You sit by the fire, the flames dancing and hypnotizing, sipping a bitter but essential tea brewed from pine needles. It's not a pleasant drink, but you know it is rich in the vitamin C that prevents the dreaded scurvy, a disease that plagued and killed many mountain men during the long winter months when fresh food was an impossible luxury. Through the small translucent window, you can see the vast, empty, achingly beautiful mountain landscape stretching out to a razor-sharp horizon. It is a vista of sublime, almost divine beauty. But it is also a vista of profound, terrifying isolation. You have not seen another human face, nor heard another human voice besides your own in nearly 2 months. Sam, your mentor, had a name for it. He called it the winter madness. I've seen good men, strong men, crack like thin river ice out here, he had told you during your first terrifying winter, his voice low and serious. The silence gets inside them. The mind starts playing tricks on them. They start talking to themselves, which ain't so bad. But then they start answering back, in a different voice. I had a partner once, a good man named Silas. He ended up in such a fierce, all-day argument with himself that he completely forgot to tend the fire. He just sat there shouting at the empty air. We found him frozen solid come the spring thaw. He was surrounded by a huge pile of firewood he never even bothered to burn. The mountain men who endured, the ones who survived for decades, were those who had intuitively developed a sophisticated and robust set of psychological techniques to combat this ever-present threat. You reach for your journal, a precious, handmade book of paper pages meticulously bound in thick rawhide. Writing was one of the most powerful of these mental tools. You record the date, the wind direction, the temperature, the success or failure of your traps. This practical information is valuable, but the true purpose of the journal is psychological. You then write your more personal reflections, vivid memories of your family back home, detailed plans for the spring thaw and the journey to the annual rendezvous, your observations on the subtle, shifting quality of the winter light on the snow. The simple physical act of putting your chaotic, swirling thoughts onto paper gives them structure and coherence. It externalizes them, preventing the aimless, circular, and often dark wanderings of an unoccupied mind that can lead to despair and madness. Keep your hands busy, boy, and your mind will have no choice but to follow, was Sam's simple but profound advice. So you follow it religiously. After you finish your writing for the day, you move on to carving. This was another common mountain man pastime that served both a practical and a deeply psychological purpose. From a piece of seasoned pine, you are fashioning a new, more ergonomic handle for your heavy skinning knife. The meticulous, detailed work requires intense concentration and fine motor skills, forcing your mind to focus entirely on the immediate, tangible task at hand, rather than dwelling on the immense, suffocating isolation or the ever-present dangers just outside your door. You think about Tom Jenkins, another solitary trapper, whose cabin, you know from your hand-drawn map, lies about 15 hard miles to the east, across two ridges in a frozen river. Before the first snows came and made travel impossible, you and Tom had established a simple but effective communication system. A prearranged smoke signal, 3 distinct puffs of smoke from a specific visible ridgetop, meant a dire emergency, an injury, or a catastrophic shelter failure. If either of you saw that signal, the other was honor-bound to go and render aid, regardless of the conditions. This informal, unspoken network, this simple knowledge that you were not entirely and absolutely alone in this vast wilderness, provided a powerful, comforting psychological anchor in the stormy sea of loneliness. After a successful check of your nearby trap line yields a fat, healthy snowshoe hare, your spirits lift immeasurably. The fresh meat will be a welcome and much-needed nutritional boost, but the successful hunt itself is a potent antidote to the creeping feelings of helplessness and despair that isolation can breed. It is a powerful reaffirmation of your competence, your skills, your ability to provide for yourself and to wrest a living from this harsh, unforgiving land. As the rich, savory aroma of a rabbit stew begins to fill the small, smoky shelter, it feels less like a primitive hut and more like a real home. As the early evening darkness falls, you begin your daily story cycle. The most experienced mountain men often had dozens of long, intricate stories, epic poems, and folk songs memorized, which they would recite aloud to themselves during the long, dark winter evenings. You speak into the silence the grand heroic tale of Hugh Glass, the legendary mountain man who was mauled by a grizzly bear, left for dead by his companions, and then crawled and stumbled over 200 miles through hostile territory to the safety of the nearest fort. Speaking aloud does several things. It breaks the oppressive, maddening silence. It exercises your voice after long days of disuse, and it powerfully reinforces the narrative of survival against overwhelming odds, a narrative that is central to your own psychological resilience. From beneath your sleeping platform, you take out a small, simple wooden flute that you painstakingly carved last winter. Music was another powerful psychological tool, a way to provide emotional release, creative expression, and a vital connection to the human culture you had left far behind. You play a simple, haunting, melancholic tune that Sam taught you. The clear, lonely notes fill the small, warm space, a small act of pure creation in a world that is almost entirely defined by stark, brutal preservation. Before you finally allow yourself to sleep, you practice one last, and perhaps most important, psychological technique that Sam had insisted you learn: the gratitude inventory. You lie back on your robes, close your eyes, and methodically, deliberately, list the positives of your current precarious situation. You have a sound, dry, and warm shelter. You have a full belly from the fresh rabbit stew. You have a roaring, healthy fire. You have your health, your strength, and your youth. You have the accumulated knowledge to survive. This simple, conscious act of gratitude powerfully counteracts the mind's natural tendency in isolation to focus on the negative, on what is lacking. It reframes your perception of your situation from one of constant deprivation and hardship to one of hard-won sufficiency and abundance. The mountain men who survived and thrived were not just masters of their external environment, they were the masters of their own minds. They understood on a deep, intuitive level that the most important and most vulnerable shelter they had to build and maintain was the one inside their own skull. Physical and psychological.
You are woken from a deep sleep by the sound of absolute, profound silence. After days of the blizzard's relentless, maddening howl, the quiet is so complete it is almost unsettling, a void where a constant pressure used to be. A pale, ethereal blue light filters through the small window, the unmistakable crystal-clear light of dawn in the high mountains after a massive snowfall. The air inside your shelter is cold, a sharp, clean cold, but it is not the deadly, life-threatening cold of a dead fire. Though the flames have once again burned down to a deep bed of glowing embers during the long night, the incredible thermal mass of the massive stone fireplace has done its sacred job, slowly and consistently bleeding stored heat into the room all night, keeping the ambient temperature from plummeting into the danger zone. Your first conscious thought is of the critical roof repair you performed yesterday. You look up at the spot on the ceiling that had been ominously leaking. It is completely dry. Your quick, decisive fix has held through the night. Your second thought is far more pressing and immediate. The indoor woodpile, once a proud and comforting monument to preparedness, is now dangerously, frighteningly low. The storm has finally passed, but its consequences and challenges remain. Today, without fail, you must venture out into the newly transformed world to replenish your fuel supply. In the brutal economy of the mountain winter, running out of firewood is the equivalent of bankruptcy, a death sentence from which there is no appeal. But what if things had gone truly, catastrophically wrong? What if the blizzard hadn't passed? What if your chimney, weakened by the relentless wind, had collapsed in the middle of the night? What if your roof, despite your best efforts, had finally succumbed to the immense weight of the snow and caved in? This day-to-day existence of maintenance and resource gathering required constant, grinding vigilance, but the true masters of mountain survival, the men who lived to old age, were defined not by how they handled the routine, but by their unflappable readiness for total, catastrophic system failure. Martha Caldwell, a homesteader's wife, faced exactly that unimaginable scenario during the legendary Great Blizzard of 1856. Their chimney, improperly and hastily built by a well-meaning but inexperienced neighbor, collapsed under the unprecedented snow load, instantly turning their primary life-giving heating system into a gaping, roaring hole to the storm. Her husband Jacob was away on a long trapping line. She and her 3 small, terrified children were completely alone. Her diary entry from that harrowing week is a chilling, stark testament to human resilience. The crash came at the stroke of midnight. A thunderous, grinding roar of falling stones and a sudden violent avalanche of snow pouring down where our warm, comforting hearth had been just moments before. The cold rushed in like a hungry, tangible wolf, a physical presence that stole the breath from our lungs. I gathered the children into the corner of the cabin furthest from the breach, piling every buffalo robe, every wool blanket, every scrap of cloth we possessed upon them. And then, through the fog of my terror, I remembered Jacob's lessons. The lessons about the emergency heat. Those lessons, a body of knowledge passed down from veteran, hardened mountain men to her husband, saved her family's life. With the main fireplace gone, she implemented a series of backup heating procedures, created emergency ventilation channels to prevent suffocation, and utilized a host of other survival techniques that kept her small family alive for 6 brutal days until the storm finally passed and repairs could be made. You begin to pull on your many layers of clothing, preparing for your own wood-gathering expedition. As you dress, you methodically, mentally, review your own emergency protocols, the ones Sam had drilled into you with a relentless, unforgiving intensity. Emergency heating systems. What was the protocol if your fireplace failed catastrophically? The very first line of defense was extreme body heat conservation. You had your layers of wool and buckskin clothing, and the thick, insulating pile of buffalo robes. Sam had taught you the critical technique of how to build a small, improvised shelter within the larger, compromised shelter. Cleared the smallest, most defensible corner I could, he had recounted, telling the story of a time his own cabin roof had partially collapsed under a record snowfall. Used the fallen timbers, the broken furniture, anything I could find, to make a tiny, tent-like structure. Hung blankets and hides over it to make the space even smaller, no bigger than a coffin. Pulled on every last stitch of clothing I owned. Then I just sat there, huddled in that little cocoon, and waited. Your body puts out a surprising amount of heat. A small enough space keeps it close to you. I survived for 3 full days like that, until I could dig my way out and make the necessary repairs. Beyond that ultimate, desperate measure, you had your cache of heatable stones, which, as a secondary system, could provide localized, life-sustaining warmth for many hours. Emergency fuel procurement. As you gather your heavy felling axe in a small, sturdy handsold, you think about the terrifying scenario where your primary woodpile was buried by an avalanche or, even worse, destroyed by a fire. The true survivor always knew how to find and prepare emergency fuel. Deadfall wood, of course, was the first choice. But beyond that, they knew that dry, standing bark stripped from certain species of trees, hardened clumps of sagebrush, or even tightly packed bundles of pine cones could be burned in a pinch to produce life-saving heat. Had to get real creative once, Sam had chuckled, telling a story of an early foolish winter where an avalanche had completely buried his entire, meticulously stacked wood supply. I started burning everything wooden in that cabin that wasn't holding up the roof. Spare tool handles, a broken snowshoe frame, even the damn chair I had carved. I survived by thinking beyond the idea of a traditional woodpile. You step outside, the world is utterly transformed, reborn. It is buried under a thick, pristine, almost blindingly white blanket of new snow. The cold hits you like a physical blow, instantly numbing any exposed skin. The sky above is a painful, achingly brilliant blue, and the morning sun glitters off the endless field of snow crystals with a blinding, disorienting intensity. You must first clear a path from your own door. You grab the heavy wooden snow shovel that hangs on pegs beside the entrance and begin the arduous task of digging out. The new snow is deep, waist-high in places, but it is light and powdery, making the work less strenuous than it could have been. Still, in this extreme cold, any physical exertion makes you sweat, a deceptively dangerous situation. You pace yourself, digging for a few minutes, and then resting, allowing the cold air to cool you, preventing the buildup of dangerous moisture in your clothing. With a usable path cleared, you strap on your freshly repaired snowshoes, your passports to mobility in this deep snow, whirled and head toward a familiar stand of dead timber about 100 yards from your shelter. As you trudge through the deep powder, your snowshoes keeping you afloat, you select your targets carefully. Dead standing timber is the best, as it's already seasoned by the elements, but not yet rotten. Greenwood burns poorly, producing excessive smoke and little heat. Wood that's been on the ground for too long absorbs moisture from the snow and becomes nearly impossible to light. As you turn back toward your shelter with the first heavy load of wood on your sled, you notice something that makes you pause, your heart suddenly beating faster. Fresh tracks in the new snow, about 50 yards to your right. Wolf tracks, and big ones. The tracks of a large, lone male. A stark, visceral reminder that the cold is not the only active danger in these mountains. You hurry back to your shelter, unload the wood, and make 2 more tense, watchful gathering trips before deciding you have enough to last for several days. The presence of the wolf now weighs heavily on your mind. A hungry wolf pack in the deep of winter can be bold enough to attack a lone human, but a lone wolf is often more unpredictable and potentially more dangerous. Back inside your sanctuary, with the heavy door securely latched, you add some of the new wood to the fire and gratefully warm your hands. The shelter had cooled significantly during your absence, but it quickly warms again as the fire builds. You remove your outer layers, hanging them near the hearth to dry any sweat that accumulated during your hard work. With the wood-gathering expedition successful, your thoughts turn to other potential emergencies. As you sip hot pine needle tea, you meticulously scan the roof and walls of your shelter from the inside, checking for any new signs of stress or strain from the recent, immense snow load. The roof's steep, well-designed angle has allowed most of the snow to slide off, preventing a dangerous accumulation. The heavy walls show no signs of bowing or cracking. Your shelter, your partner in survival, has weathered the great blizzard well. But what if it hadn't? What if, like Sam's old cabin or the Caldwell family's chimney, some critical part of your shelter had failed during the storm? Experienced mountain men had established protocols for this as well. They developed emergency repair techniques that used materials and tools that were readily available, even during severe weather conditions. In a dedicated corner of your shelter, you keep your emergency repair kit, a small, tightly wrapped bundle containing extra chinking material, a long coil of strong rawhide cordage, a small sharp bucksaw, several pre-carved wooden wedges, and other essential tools that would allow you to make critical, life-saving fixes, even in the worst imaginable conditions. Being prepared for a potential structural failure could mean the difference between life and death. When my main roof beam started to go that one winter, Sam had told you once, his eyes distant with the memory, I didn't panic. Panic is a luxury you can't afford. I grabbed those heavy support poles I always keep cut and ready for just such an occasion. I braced the sagging section of the roof, then I packed snow on top of some spare hides to seal the new gaps. It wasn't pretty, but it kept me alive and dry until the storm passed, and I could get outside to make the proper, permanent repairs. He understood that emergency repairs were often a desperate race against time, and that having both the materials and the knowledge ready to go was the key to winning that race. But what if the damage was too severe for any kind of repair? What if the shelter became completely, catastrophically uninhabitable? There was always the ultimate backup plan, the shelter of last resort, backup shelter construction. The most common and effective backup shelter was the snow cave, A remarkable survival shelter that could be created in any deep snowdrift using nothing more than a knife, a small shovel, or even just your hands. A properly constructed snow cave with an entrance tunnel that curves upwards into a raised sleeping chamber can maintain an interior temperature at or near freezing, even when the outside temperatures drop to 30 or 40 degrees below zero. It's cold, to be sure, but it is survivable. Sam had described building one when his very first mountain cabin, a poorly built affair from his greenhorn days, had burned to the ground in the middle of a January night. Dug like a panicked badger into a big deep drift on the lee side of a hill, he had said. Made an entrance tunnel that curved up so the cold air would stay trapped in the entrance. Carved out a sleeping chamber just big enough for my body, about the size of a large dog kennel. My own body heat, trapped in that small insulated space, brought the temperature up just enough to keep me from freezing to death. I lived in that snow hole for 11 days, until I could fell new trees and build a proper shelter. It wasn't comfortable, but I'm here to tell the tale. The old mountain man's story highlights a critical central aspect of mountain survival. Always have a backup plan. Primary shelters might fail. Primary heating systems might become compromised. In those extreme situations, having the knowledge and the will to quickly and effectively implement an alternative often meant the difference between life and death. You stoke the fire again, adding a larger, denser log of oak that will burn slowly for hours. The interior of your shelter is warm now, almost comfortable, but your mind remains focused on emergency preparations. There were still more protocols to consider, more dangers to anticipate. The mountains demanded nothing less than total, constant preparedness. The price of complacency was absolute. As you sleep, the snow begins to fall again outside. Soft, silent, impossibly gentle flakes drifting down in the absolute profound darkness of the mountain night. They cover the tracks of the lone wolf. They blanket the world in a fresh, clean layer of white. Inside, the temperature remains remarkably stable. The shelter's complex, integrated systems, the hard-won product of generations of brutal, unforgiving trial and error, are working in perfect, silent concert. The immense thermal mass of the heavy stones bleeds a steady, radiant warmth into the air. The meticulously maintained chinking repels the probing, invisible fingers of the wind. The carefully banked fire burns slow and steady, a faithful, unwavering guardian through the long, dark hours of the night. The true legacy of the mountain men is not found merely in the thrilling, romanticized tales of their adventures. It is found in the quiet, humble, and profound genius of their creations. Their shelters were not just passive structures. They were active, dynamic expressions of a deep and respectful relationship with their environment. They were holistic, living systems, built by working with the powerful principles of nature rather than foolishly and arrogantly fighting against them. They understood, in their very bones, that the earth itself could be the most effective insulation, that a simple stone could be a powerful thermal battery, that the relentless wind could be a powerful ally if you only knew how to hide from it properly. As the veteran mountain man Jeremiah Collins wrote with stark simplicity in his 1887 memoir, "A man's shelter is his very life in these mountains. Build it right, and it will keep you warm and safe through the worst storms that nature can possibly send. Build it wrong, and it inevitably becomes your tomb." And now, as you rest comfortably in your own bed, cushioned and protected by a universe of modern comforts that these men could scarcely have imagined, perhaps there is a deep and valuable lesson to be learned. In a world that is increasingly and dangerously disconnected from the natural systems that support all life, their story is a powerful, resonant reminder. A reminder of our own innate and often forgotten capacity for ingenuity, for adaptation, for profound resilience. A reminder that true, lasting security isn't always found in the newest, most complex technology, but can sometimes be discovered in a deep, quiet, and humble understanding of the world around us. Shelters of the mountain men stand as enduring testaments to the remarkable fact that with the right knowledge, with the right mindset, human beings can create sustainable pockets of life, warmth, and even hope in the most hostile, unforgiving corners of our planet. So sleep well. And know that you, too, carry within you that same ancient capacity for resilience, that same brilliant spark of human ingenuity that allowed them to face the deadliest blizzards the world could throw at them and emerge, time and time again, to see the next glorious sunrise.